Hello and welcome to episode 12 of the Social Innovation Think Tank, where we discuss the latest ideas in thinking about social innovation. My name is Paul Tracy. I'm Professor of Innovation and Organisation at the Cambridge Judge Business School and Co-Director of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation. We have here as well my colleague and co-host Neil Stott, who's also Co-Director of the Centre for Social Innovation and who leads the Masters programme that we run.
Hi there.
And I'm delighted to welcome as well today's guest, who is Professor Jaideep Prabhu. Jaideep is Professor of Marketing, Nehru Professor of Indian Business and Enterprise, and Director of the Centre for Indian Global Business at the Cambridge Judge Business School. So Jaideep is a colleague. And much of Jaideep's research is focused on innovation and marketing strategy in high technology contexts and industries. He's also published widely on the concepts of jugaad innovation and frugal innovation, including two influential books, where he shows how entrepreneurs and companies in India and elsewhere are often able to innovate in radical ways despite the resource constraints that they seem to face. But we invited him on today to talk about a quite different topic, about a book that he has just written, which is called How Should a Government Be? The New Levers of State Power, in which he, in which he examines how technology is transforming government around the world and indeed changing, he argues, the nature of the political debate about the role of government, what it means to be an effective government. Jaideep, thank you very much indeed for talking with us today. Now, you're a marketing scholar, you're a professor of Indian business, and so we were curious, what prompted you then to write a book about effective government?
Well, first of all, Paul and Neil, it's a great delight, and pleasure to be doing this. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak about the book. And Paul, that's a great way to start, actually. What's a business school professor and a professor of marketing doing writing about government? And that's a question I still ask myself, having written the book. It may seem strange for a business school professor and a professor of marketing, a professor of Indian business to be writing about a book about government. But actually, it's been quite an organic process and a journey, which really begins with my research on innovation in the private sector. So as you mentioned in your introduction, I've spent my career studying innovation in companies. First, I studied, really big Western corporations and how they did innovation. And then, as you said, I turned my attention to emerging markets like India, resource-constrained environments, and looked at how innovation happens there. And it's really that research into frugal innovation and jugaad that has led me to write this book. I've been struck over the last decade or so by how increasingly small teams, sometimes our students in places like Cambridge, can now do things and create solutions, not just in software, but even in hardware, that only large companies or the government could have done 10 or 20 years ago. And we see this across sectors, these really affordable solutions, that have been developed faster, better, cheaper. We see this in software, like you see WhatsApp, which was famously developed by 4 people in less than 12 months with about 250K in seed capital. We see this in hardware with things like the Raspberry Pi, developed by one of our former students, colleagues at Cambridge in the computer science department, who came up with this cheap computer to help kids and people and adults program. We see this in the developing world, things like M-Pesa, the service that was introduced in Kenya to enable people who are outside the banking system to be able to use their basic mobile phones, not only to talk, but to request money transfers, which they could accept as a text message and then cash in their local corner shop. We see this in the West, where, in universities like Berkeley, companies have spun out to create medical devices that plug into the audio jack of a smartphone and do telemedicine. So this phenomenon has sort of absorbed my interest, and I ended up, as you said, writing these 2 books, Jugaad Innovation, about this phenomenon in the emerging world, and then a follow-up book in 2015 called Frugal Innovation about the phenomenon in the West. And every time I spoke about these books to audiences, including of your students on the MST, someone would invariably ask me, what does this mean for governments? And sometimes they would even tell me, what it meant from their own experience, if they were working in government or had some experience of government. And so that got me thinking, what does this mean for governments? And I realized there were two aspects to it. There was the aspect of what it meant for how governments do their work and deliver for their citizens, in which regard they're quite a bit like businesses. But there was also this other aspect, which was how should they manage this phenomenon and cultivate this phenomenon, regulate this phenomenon in the economy. So really it's been a journey. And as I said, it came from this previous research. It came from people who I would talk to, including our students. It came from executive programs that we have done with civil servants from around the world. It came from the fact that Cambridge has a Center for Science and Policy where we've had executives from various governments, but particularly the US government come in. And so over a period of time, talking to students, talking to civil servants, thinking about this and writing about this, that's how I came to write the book on government.
Thank you. I guess my next question follows on quite tightly from the previous one, which is that government, as you know, has tended to occupy a very marginal place in business schools, as you hinted at. So thinking forward, going forward, how might business schools take the role of government more seriously in its teaching programs, in its research?
Yeah, that's again excellent question. And as you know, we hardly ever think or write or teach about the role of the government in business schools. Not nearly enough, I think, even those who do. And really, I think I've tried to understand this myself. Why is that the case? And I think it's to a great extent because our business schools and the curriculum, our research has been driven by people in the West and about Western businesses and Western business. And I think in the West, the understanding or the feeling is, well, the government does what it does, and then it sets the rules of the game. And within the rules of the game, then businesses have to decide how to function, and that's where business schools come in. So that's where we do our research on what businesses should do given these rules, which we really don't have much influence over and really shouldn't spend too much time thinking about. The rules are given, and then we think about how do businesses play in that space, what should they do, all this kind of stuff. But you mentioned I'm a professor of Indian business, and actually when I took up the chair, I hadn't really done very much work on India, and then began to. And when you look at emerging markets like India, you realize that you cannot talk about business, cannot think about business independent of the government. The state is so present and so important. Some of the rules that you might take for granted in developed economies may not exist. Those institutions may be in the process of forming. The regulations and the policies are in the process of being implemented. And really businesses have to keep up with that. And you really have to, when you're doing research on businesses in those contexts, think about the interaction with the government. And increasingly, I find that's true even in the West, particularly in emerging sectors. When we talk about new technologies, it's very hard to think about what a business should do if the business is not aware of what the policy is going to be, or how the policy is going to change, or what the regulation is like. So that's preamble as to why it's important and why it hasn't been studied before. And I think it's going to be studied more in business schools. Now, what role can we play? I think obviously as researchers, there are two kinds of questions we could ask. We could look at how governments operate as organizations do in serving their citizens in the way that we study how companies serve their customers better, how they can understand the needs of their citizens better, involve them in coming up with solutions, and then deliver those solutions faster, better, cheaper. So that's one set of things we could study. Another set of things we could study is how governments should then manage the economy, how they should regulate these new technologies in these new spaces, how they can then cultivate and foster this kind of innovation in the economy, in communities, and in the private sector. So, we can research those topics, and in fact, we can then teach these topics. And in fact, I think we're already teaching these topics. In executive education, we have many programs about public sector management and leadership for civil servants or people working in state-owned enterprises. We help them manage better using all the tools that we've developed to help managers in the private sector manage and lead better. But equally, we have programs in our school, for instance, like the MPhil in technology policy, where we're thinking very hard about how civil servants and regulators and policymakers can think about all these new technologies that are coming on board, like AI, robotics, genetic engineering, autonomous vehicles, etc. How can governments be smarter in how they regulate? How can they be more proactive and entrepreneurial, take a bit of risk? How can they cultivate these different actors, coordinate their activities to ensure that you have a thriving sector, but ensuring also that citizens are protected?
Do you think this is partly because of COVID, that people, including business school professors, had forgotten really the real role of the state and the potential power of the state, parked it to one side, and COVID has really shown us, particularly in the West, that that the state is still incredibly powerful, has a lot of influence on our lives, be it as citizens or business people, and all of a sudden we've woken up to this fact.
I think you're touching on a really interesting point, Neil, which is that this times of crisis, it's almost as if in times of stability, when everything is ticking over very nicely, the government has its policies which are not quite stable, particularly if you're thinking about the West. The policies are stable, everybody plays their role, everything moves along very nicely, people have a good life, and there aren't any shocks. But the moment you have a crisis, whether it's a financial crisis, when we had that crash in 2008, 2009, or it's a pandemic, an act of nature, like we just had over the last year, then I think people sit up and then realize again what the role of the state can and should be. And then you start to realize there are whole areas of the economy and our lives where the state and governments have a crucial role. And where their ability, the ability of the state to do good and bad is enormous, right? And so they have, and that's when they become particularly interested in what their states are doing and what their leaders are doing. So I think you're absolutely right. It's almost like sometimes we need to be shaken out of our complacency to recognize these things that we take for granted, particularly the role of the state and the state operating well in our interests. But I would argue that you sometimes have crises because we have been too complacent and we haven't focused on the role of various players, particularly the role of the state. You could argue that the financial crisis happened because we had at least a decade, possibly 2 decades, of increasing complacency in various sectors, including academia, about the role of the state and regulation. There was increasing deregulation and laissez-faire that led up to that financial crisis. And the consequences were then the governments had to come in a big way. They had to bail out the banks, which were in many ways the culprits or the cause of the situation. And then they had to also do things like, pumping money into the economy. And they had to then be overly regulatory and overly controlling of the economy to ensure that something like that didn't happen again. So I think, perhaps we go through these cycles of stable times when we get complacent, and then a crisis, and then we realize again why we have all these institutions and why they matter. And then perhaps we're just doomed to repeat the cycle. But maybe after COVID, that won't happen. We'll see.
So one of our previous guests, Professor Martin Parker, he would possibly argue, I can't speak for him, but he would possibly argue that business schools have been part of the problem, not necessarily the solution. So all the things that you mentioned, Jaideep, are things that were gloriously celebrated and communicated by business schools, and we've led ourselves down a path that could have ended very badly.
Well, I think business schools have to accept a part of the blame. But I would say not all business schools, perhaps some business schools that particularly push that line. And I would argue more than the average business school professor, if I may be permitted to say this, I think economists, certain economists must take the blame here. Because there is a particular strand of economic thinking that lends itself particularly to a libertarian extreme. a laissez-faire extreme, a deregulatory kind of mindset that took hold, I think, of certain parts of particularly Western governments and the way they control their economies or manage their economies. And I think it was that particular strain that, for various reasons, some of them good reasons, there were some good arguments for that kind of strain of thinking in economics and in political not just a theory, but in actual action. So actually in the book, very early on, I get into that debate about how a government should be. And I actually look at these two polar opposites, oppositional views about how a government should be. And yes, on one hand, you have libertarians, who are skeptical of government and who generally believe that governments are inefficient and ineffective at best, and that at worst they are dangerous because if given too much power, they can be authoritarian and so on. And then at the other end, you have statists, those who are sanguine about the role of government. In fact, they see it as a very benevolent force, as perhaps the only force that can protect society from the vagaries of nature or the market. And really, what I examine is how these two views have dominated countries over time. Sometimes one, sometimes the other. And really, like all polarities, I feel they have elements of truth to them. So for instance, yes, as libertarians say, governments can be inefficient and ineffective. I grew up in India where the state was all powerful and smothered activity and freedoms, I would argue. But equally, there are many areas we're discovering now in the crisis. There are many areas where the state has a crucial role. And if it doesn't play that role, we have disastrous consequences. So I feel, and I argue in the book, that it's not right to just argue that we should roll back the state. But equally, I don't think states can grow endlessly and spend endlessly. So how to strike the balance, really, I think that's key. How can we as citizens ensure that our elected leaders and so on are able to strike that balance between efficiency and effectiveness on the one hand, but also ensuring our freedoms on the other?
Great, thank you. So I think what's really striking when you read the book is that technology is a core theme threaded throughout, and it really you really use it to set up the book. So can you tell us a little bit more about why you think digital technology has the potential to have such a disruptive impact on the way that government works?
Yeah, that's really the core in a sense, and that's really my angle, because as you know, I've studied innovation, and of course technology plays a key role, and I've been particularly interested in the disruptive potential of digital technologies. So this idea now that now small teams can do stuff that only big companies or the government could do before is really driven by the availability of these ubiquitous tools and technologies. Everything from smartphones to cloud computing to social media to crowdfunding to these maker spaces. So it's not just in software, it's also in hardware, where in these maker spaces, you get access to digital manufacturing tools like 3D printers and so on. And then these communities of people who are involved in these activities, these makers, who are tinkering, sharing their ideas, then can put their designs on the internet for others to try out elsewhere. So, there's tremendous creative potential here, innovative potential. There's tremendous opportunity for people to get involved in solving problems in their communities, sometimes for the sake of, a social mission, sometimes to prototype and then commercialize it, or to combine those two threads. So there's tremendous positive potential. But equally, we've seen how some of these digital technologies, these startups can, on the back of data and smart, business models, can grow very fast and accumulate immense wealth and power, but concentrated in the hands of a few. And of course, then that concentrated power can be used and misused. And so we see now the world sort of kind of turning against these digital giants, these companies that were valorized in the press and in society. People are now wondering whether the drawbacks outweigh the benefits, when we see things like fake news and we see the polarization, we see these tribal communities on social media, able to live in their own bubbles, and in a sense, sometimes aided and abetted by the companies that run those platforms, or at least the companies, are not able to or not willing to do much about it because their business models depend on having all this kind of activity on their platform. So there's tremendous opportunity there, but also huge challenges. And I think this is where we need to think about this role of the state, because in a sense, who's going to be that referee or the umpire? Who's the neutral institution? What is the neutral institution that can potentially keep the public interest and common interest, hold it, preserve it in a sense? That's the state and the government. And so I think, again, these new technologies, all these possibilities require the state to have a smart, proactive, strategic approach to new technologies. On the one hand, from the regulatory front, they have to be smart in such a way that they don't regulate too early or in too draconian a way, because that might kill these new technologies before they have a chance to do any good in the world. But equally, they can't just be laissez-faire and not do anything or regulate too late, because then some of the damage may be done. So I look at how, for instance, in the UK, the government has set up a Center for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles to play precisely that proactive strategic role, to engage early with all the players that might potentially be involved, from universities to large and small car companies, software companies, insurance agents, legal lawyers, and so on. Engage them early on to give them a platform to test in a safe way, even on the streets, collect the data, understand what works and what doesn't work, but then equally understand what are some of the challenges of the technology, get them to collaborate with some seed money to try out new technologies, learn what works and what doesn't work, understand what issues they would need to think about in terms of regulation or reskilling people and so forth. And so I think that's one of the key arguments I make. This is important for us increasingly, for our state and our state officials, our regulators, our policymakers, to really understand technology and work proactively with all these players to ensure that we get the benefits without some of the drawbacks.
To what extent, Jaideep, do you think the government can really play this neutral role, this role of the referee that you talked about, given that government is by definition political?
Okay, now that's, you're touching, Paul, on perhaps the weakest spot in my book, and also in someone from a business school who thinks more about management and innovation, and not so much about politics. So I have been aware of that aspect of the book, that I actually I duck the question, frankly. I try to avoid the political aspects of this and try to focus as far as possible on the management, or shall we say technical aspects of it. Now, you may say that that's a cop-out, right? And you may be right in saying that. But here's my thinking. So as I said, you have these polarities. You have the libertarians and statists, and of course you have these partisan groups in society, and they're pushing us in these, or pulling us in these two directions. But I think there's a vast middle ground where even these extreme views and people who hold to these views can agree on what is the right way forward, where they can agree that there are things that governments can do better, faster, cheaper, etc. And I try to operate in that space as far as possible. That's my strategy to sort of duck the political question head on. But you're right, there are obviously many times when these could clash, when what makes sense from a management perspective, from an operational perspective, clashes with an ideological position at either extreme. So an extreme libertarian may deliberately want to sabotage government's ability to do things better because they're just fundamentally opposed to the state playing any kind of role. Equally, statists might want to give the state powers that it ought not to have. Particularly think about in authoritarian countries where you don't have the balance of powers and so on. So I think that's a big question. I try to address it somewhat, and then I try to move on to questions that might be less politically charged and where we might agree that it makes sense to think about a more managerial or more technocratic approach to these questions.
Thank you. Neil?
Yeah, so one of the key ideas in the book is the difference between the big state, the small state, and smarter government, which you just been touched upon. But where does scale, where does geography come into this? How would you prioritize, if at all, the local, the national, the international?
Again, a wonderful question. And I do get into that because one of the things that I was struck by is how governments, we obviously know, operate at different levels, but how different government at different levels is in terms of its ability to do things and also its proximity to its own citizens and the scale of what it's trying to do. So I, at various points, I have cases throughout the book. Some of them describe things that are happening at a federal level. So in a big country like China or India or the US, you have that level of activity, or Canada for that matter. But then you also have in many of these bigger countries, a provincial or a state level. And if it's a federal structure, the states have a lot of autonomy and can do, like in the US. And then of course you have the city level. And I found that the most interesting. And there are a few cases of what's happening in mayor's offices. I talk about the mayor of Stockton and what he did. Stockton is in California, and this was the youngest mayor at that time, and an African-American mayor who between 2016 and 2020 was mayor, and he introduced a form of universal basic income in his city as an experiment, and he did it. They did it quite rigorously with a lot of evaluation and choosing very carefully who would get it and how much they would get and so on. I also look at Boston and what the mayor of Boston did to solve this problem that afflicts not just the government but also large companies, which is that you're trying to do, any large organization is trying to do two very different things at the same time and struggles to do that. On the one hand, business as usual, delivering your current services to your current customers, citizens, but then you're also trying to do new things, to come up with new solutions to maybe new groups of people and so on. And that's the innovation, that's the risky bit. And companies struggle with this because it requires ambidexterity and so on. And they solve it by creating a separate unit, a skunk works or an R&D team or something that will do the more experimental, innovative stuff, while the organization as a whole does business as usual. And I was very intrigued to find that Boston had done precisely that. They'd created a unit called the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics to be precisely that innovation engine and try out new stuff and take the risk and fail and then try and scale it in partnership with government departments. So that was the most fascinating thing to me, that somehow at the city level, it becomes possible. Some of these problems that we think are insurmountable, including the political one, Paul, that we think are insurmountable when we think of governments at the federal level or the national level, are not so complicated, are not so difficult to solve at the city level. It's the city level you tend to have a scale and a scope of government that's more manageable, that's more human. A mayor who has the appropriate powers in the space of 4 or 5 years would probably typically know that context very well, will know the community, will have grown up there, will have that kind of relationship, will know who are the other players, will be able to engage the other players, whether they're startups or big companies or NGOs and charities. And they can work on projects that will see the light of day and where they will have a response pretty quickly from their citizens. Like in Boston, the experiments that they run, they get an immediate response and they're able to sense, whether things will work or not work from the citizens of the city. The moment you go to the state level, that becomes a bit harder, but still possible to do it. And often if you have a governor or a chief minister, they can be quite entrepreneurial. They can do something similar to mayors. The moment you go to the federal level, it becomes far more messy. There's a lot of sludge. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There are a lot of layers. There are lots of checks and balances. It becomes harder. And actually, I owe both of you a debt of gratitude, because a couple of years ago when I taught on the MST, one of your students, Aliyah Velji from Canada, who's a civil servant in the Canadian system, told me about these problems. And she, as it turned out, had worked at the city level in Edmonton. then at the provincial level in Alberta, and then at the federal level in Ottawa. And based on her experience, this became so clear that when she went higher up in government, it became harder to change the culture, to change the mindset, to change the structures. And it becomes more frustrating, really, for people who are trying to bring about change. So that's a brilliant question, and I think I do get to it in various parts of the book.
So one thing I think is very important. I mean, you're probably aware of the doomsday clock, you know, the bulletin of atomic scientists that moves backwards and forwards. What's very interesting about its movement is when he moves back, it tends to be at times of major international agreements, be it climate change, be it, you know, nuclear proliferation treaties, etc. But what they said this year and last year, when it's at 100 seconds to midnight, is the biggest problem at the moment is this gap, this weakening of international institutions, you know, because people are not playing nice together. But that can also happen down the sort of political food chain. So what does your book speak to? How do we play together better?
Yeah, that, you know, again, great question. And frankly, I don't get to that. Most of what I look at is governments within sovereign states, you know, so national and subnational. I don't look at transnational. And I did think about those questions, but I realized that was really beyond the scope of the book and really beyond the scope of my expertise, because then we really get into international relations, politics, and, you know, the public sector management. But it remains important. And, you know, we've seen that, like the EU, take the EU, which is probably the world's most impressive experiment with that kind of transnational cooperation between sovereign states. But of course, we have the UN and we have WHO now and so on. And I think that, you know, to some extent, maybe, and again, this is not stuff I've written about in the book, but things that I've thought about and respond to your question. I think, you know, you might argue that it's the failure of sovereign states at the national level and subnational level to deliver for their citizens that have undermined some of this cooperation and coordination between states. You know, if citizens, the man and woman on the street, feel that they can't trust their own governments, then they're not going to trust some transnational government, right? They're going to be even more suspicious. Let's take the Brexit vote and the turn against the EU in quite a sizable part of the UK population. What is the source of distrust and dissatisfaction? Yes, to some extent it's with Brussels, but some people argue it's also with Westminster. It was, you know, an increasing feeling of being abandoned by your elected officials in favor of unelected officials. So if the elected officials had perhaps done their job and they were trusted by their own citizens, then their citizens could trust their elected officials to hand over some of that decision-making power and authority to a transnational organization. So I think it's absolutely important. You're raising a very good point. We need that kind of cooperation between nations. But first, we need our governments to work for us, and we need to be able to trust them to work for us. And then we can trust them to work with others for us.
Without being too cynical, one could argue that the hollowing out you talked about at international level has happened at all levels of government, particularly in the UK and the West. And that hollowing out has led to voids, to spaces where people cannot engage, do not know how to engage with their government. One could argue that.
I think that's a brilliant observation. So the argument I was making about national and transnational works all the way down. Yeah. You know, if our local government worked better for us, perhaps we would, and we trusted those elected officials to work better for us, we might trust people at the next level and the next level. And actually, where the UK is concerned, I mean, this is something that comes up in my book whenever I talk about the UK, has been the phenomenon of the hollowing out of local government, of actually, despite devolution and so on, if you look at the level of councils, the power and the budgetary power has been hollowed out in favor of central government. So central government has retained and in fact has become even more powerful at the expense of local government. And this means that on the ground, the man and woman on the street has this feeling of being abandoned by their local governments because the central government has taken power away from them. They feel more removed from the government because it's the center of power is somewhere else. And then that leads to distrust and disenchantment. And I would argue that that also results in government doing its job worse. So, you know, one of my principles, key principles that I think governments should be driven by, and I devote a chapter to, is being responsive to citizens. And that is working outside in from the citizens' problems and the citizens' context, rather than inside out from the government's perspective in developing solutions. And the further away your elected officials and your government is from you, the further away they are from understanding your context. And I think this goes back to the previous question as well. At the city level, you really are in close proximity. So Tom Menino, who was the legendary mayor of Boston, I talk about for many decades, actually, was involved in public life. He used to literally beat the streets. I mean, this guy would walk around and he would find manholes that were covers that had been stolen. He would call up his own help desk in government to report this. He would meet citizens. And then this office that he set up, this little skunk works, you know, they were constantly in touch with citizens. Whenever they tried something new, they would do that with citizens. For instance, they were developing affordable housing, and they wanted to understand what citizens would consider a decent type of a house. So they tried various things. They brought them into a gym where they drew the plan on the floor, but they found that's not good enough. People can't imagine what that's, you know, what the house would look like. So then they came up with a model home that they put on a truck and took it around neighborhoods. And then you can have people come in and then they tell you, and you get a sense of, you know, you can't do that at the national level. It's much harder to do. But if you empowered mayors at the local level to do that, you gave them powers, you gave them budgets, you gave them some time, I think you could see that. And then, of course, you might end up trusting your government at that level more, and then maybe at higher levels as well.
I think a lot of these arguments are linked in part to the size of the nation state, the sovereign state, as you call it, because if you're in a country like the US or India, for example, national government is going to feel very, very far away. If you're in the Czech Republic or Ireland, then it's going to feel quite different. And also the ability of these governments to influence international affairs, to deal with multinational companies, is also going to be very different. So the size of the nation state is surely something that is really critical.
I completely agree. And, you know, as a scholar of organization, as both of you studying organizations will know, this is a question of organization, right? It affects companies which are multinational. How should they, when they're operating in many countries, you know, manage their operations? Should they have autonomous offices in each country where each subsidiary might have its autonomy to operate and respond quickly to local things? Or should they try and have a global strategy where they standardize stuff? And this clearly applies in the case of governments. Now, when you talk about big countries like India or the US, I think the federal structure works quite well. And this is, again, what we see in the transnational organization. You know, you have a matrix organization, you have, you know, product lines, and you have country lines, you know, or maybe it's the other way around. You have country lines and you have product lines. And I think in federal states like India and the US, where you and in Germany, where constitutionally you have the center, which has certain topics exclusively under its control, typically defense. But then other topics are under the control of the states. So the states have a lot of autonomy to decide their own policies around education, in India, agriculture, for instance. And that allows for experimentation as well, and which I argue is actually a strength of these big federal states. That is, they have some variation across their states, with the possibility of states deciding their own policies, for instance, on autonomous vehicles. I look at that, and how different American states have different policies on autonomous vehicles. Some are much more open to testing on public roads and so on, and set a framework. Others are linking it to electric vehicles and things like that. Others don't have a policy, or they are much more, draconian. And actually, that enables the states to learn from each other, like, okay, which works better, and, you know, not just in the short term, but over the long term. And there's a little bit of rivalry as well, because you're all trying to attract investment. But then you need a national agency that will coordinate, otherwise you'll have chaos. And so that matrix kind of organization seems to work very well in a country like the US, which has this division of power. And actually, it helps to deal with some of the dysfunctionalities of the central government as well as the federal government, as we saw, I think, during the Trump regime, when, you know, Trump went completely off-piste on things like climate change and their policies. But cities persisted and states persisted despite what the federal government might have done. So the damage that they could have done on the environmental policies was in a sense limited by having this kind of matrix organization and devolving power, certain powers, and allowing for variation and experimentation.
So turning to, the role of government and your book and social innovation. So how does it speak to social innovators listening to or watching this episode?
Well, again, great connection, because I think the book is essentially about what the two of you would define as social innovation. I mean, when we're talking about innovation in government, governments are clearly operating in the social space. In some cases, they are directly delivering social services, public services that have a social impact, and that's the intention. If you think about health and think about that, particularly now, public health during a pandemic, but also education. And even the most, shall we say, liberal states are still in those sectors, very involved in those sectors. But you also think of other services that the state delivers, social security, big area. Even in the most liberal states, governments are making huge payments to individuals and businesses, and of course, particularly in a pandemic. So there's a huge aspect of what the state does in terms of delivery, service delivery, where what it's doing in order to get better is social innovation. It's trying to have a social impact, a positive social impact, ideally, minimize negative social impact from what it does, and try to do this faster, better, cheaper. But there's also, implications of what the state should do in terms of managing social innovation in the wider economy. First of all, in terms of how they regulate and cultivate innovation in the for-profit sector and the private sector, to ensure that at least there are negative externalities. So in that sense, at least that it's not anti-social innovation, even if it's for private wealth creation, that at least companies are not then also polluting the environment or creating social unrest. So there's a role for the state to ensure that private sector innovation is socially conscious or informed or responsible. But equally, there's this amazing thing, I think we all share this in common, this phenomenon of increasingly entrepreneurs from across sectors wanting to solve social problems using the tools of business and technology. And I think that's a very promising area where the government has partners in society that are probably addressing many of the problems that government should be addressing and may not be able to do entirely on its own. And so the question is, how can the state partner with those social innovators, encourage them, help them flourish, provide an ecosystem in which they can flourish, where they can do more of that, try out experiments, and then maybe scale those experiments. The state could do that by procuring some of those solutions and helping scale them. So I think there's a huge connection with social innovation.
I mean, by nature, Jaideep, you're quite an optimist, and your book is a very optimistic piece, but there are some darker currents abroad. Populism, which we've touched on at the moment, this disconnect between people and power and politics. How does that challenge some of your arguments?
Yeah, great question. And you're absolutely spot on, Neil. I think this is a character flaw in my case. I tend to find successes where things have worked and dwell on those. And I constantly have to be reminded by, co-authors, by referees when writing academic papers, and my editor in the case of this book, but what about the dark side? When I was writing about the UID, I was focusing on all the benefits of it. He said, what about the dark side? And of course, there was a dark side, issues around privacy, security. I talk about China's social credit system, which, on the surface has some good things. It's a way to give everyone, individuals and businesses, a score based on their behavior, not only their financial, commercial behavior and whether they are able to repay loans and all that, but also their social behavior, like whether they're caught eating in public transport and what their neighbors think of them and what they do online and so on. And, interestingly, the Chinese are quite keen on this. They think that this is a good thing for the most part. But you can imagine it becoming dystopian very quickly if it's linked to facial recognition and surveillance. It could be used by an authoritarian state, or any state for that matter, against its citizens, and particularly a minority group. So I completely agree there's a dark side, but I think perhaps we dwell too much on the dark side. And yes, you're right, there's all this populist upheaval going on, and it has had real consequences, and it's in the newspapers all the time. But what we don't hear about are the ways in which government is changing all the time for the better. And it often happens below the radar, under the hood, so to speak. We hear about the national politics and all the shenanigans of politicians and all their excesses and all their failures, maybe because that makes news. We don't hear about the successes of government, where on a daily basis, civil servants are making change for the good. They're, most of them are very passionate about what they're doing. They, not only have good intentions, they're also super bright, and they're working with others to solve problems. And so I guess my character flaw, I've tried to turn it into a plus, and present that view of how governments, yes, they can be terribly inefficient, ineffective, they could be dangerous, but look, they can also do so many remarkable things. Now the question is, we as citizens, what role can we play? So my final chapter is actually, after talking about how a government should be, I say, how should citizens be? And I think that's where we individuals can play a real role. We can choose our leaders better. We can engage with people who are of a different view from us, really engage with them to understand where they're coming from. And then I think even more important, we can choose the right leaders, their teams, and then we need to hold our governments to account, not just during elections, but between elections. And I think ultimately, and this, I make a quite passionate plea for this. I think if we can't help our governments from outside, or don't want to do it from outside, we should work for the government, so work with the government. And I think particularly young people, and I think to your question, Paul, we in business schools can train and inspire young people to go work for the public sector, because the challenges there are enormous, technical and otherwise social. I think it'll draw on many of their skills and their talents. And the purpose, there is a sense of purpose in the public sector that perhaps is lacking quite often in the private sector. So anyway, that's my you're right, absolutely right, Neil, very optimistic take. And maybe writing the book was a form of therapy for me to get over some of the very difficult and pessimistic news that we see every day in the papers about politics
of course, we need hope, and I think it's a very important contribution, because these debates need to be had. And what is the role of the public? It's something that we spend a lot of time talking to our students about. And what is our role as citizens, and what is the role of business schools to actually start reconnecting with the public, not just leaving it to one side. So I think it's a very important contribution.
And if I may say, the two of you are playing a huge role in that, with your center, with the research that you do, but perhaps equally importantly, with the programs that you have, both the MST in Social Innovation, which is finding these civil servants, public servants, people working in the third sector, people working in companies who are thinking holistically about these problems, and thinking not only about the private returns, but also the social gains that can be made from this kind of innovation. And also your incubator, where you are encouraging and supporting innovators and entrepreneurs to come up with these solutions, and to develop and deliver them in society. So a big thank you to you, and also to wish you good luck in doing more of this.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Jaideep. Thank you very much indeed for speaking with us and sharing all your insights about the book. As Neil said, the role of government is so important in social innovation and in business schools. It's often neglected. And I think your book brings a really important perspective into this conversation. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you to the two of you. It's been a great pleasure. It's been wonderful to have this conversation, and hopefully we can have many more of these.